Okay, we have the last speaker of the day, so no pressure, Jeff. So we've got Jeff, and it's lights again. Lights are key. We can see that's a big feature today. So Jeff Mastin is Director of Lighting Science and Products at TotalGrow Lights. And he's going to talk to us today about horticultural light planning, demystified, which is good. I look forward to that. Jeff, it's all yours for 20 minutes.
All right, thanks, Derek. So, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Obviously, this is not the first or last LED lighting-oriented talk that you have an opportunity to attend here, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. So, like Derek said, my name's Jeff Mastin. I'm the Director of Lighting Science and Products for TotalGrow Lights. We're out of Michigan here in the U.S., and I've been invested in this horticultural LED lighting industry for about 13 years now. We are a relatively small company with broad partnerships that help us serve in virtually every aspect of horticultural LED lighting, from custom research fixtures to mass-produced, more standard lights. And over this decade plus of time in this rapidly evolving and advancing space, our focus has, to a large extent, shifted from a more technology-first focus with a novel optical approach to a more grower or application-first emphasis with a wide array of solutions and a focus on guiding folks through the complete process, though those two are never truly separate. So my goal today is to share what are hopefully some useful emphases, some tips, factors, processes, and considerations that come into play when you're progressing from start to finish through the light planning process. Because sifting and sorting through the headlines, the studies, the products, and the marketing, it can be a daunting task for anyone trying to figure out where to begin, whether that's a first exploration into the potential of lighting these days, or trying to plan out a lighting strategy for a new build, an expansion, or some other change, or seeking to tackle a specific lighting-related question. So first off, we need to have a bit of common language to be able to engage this topic productively. And at the risk of repeating things that I'm sure some already know, we'll quickly run through key terms, why they matter, and how they apply in this process. So first off, for lighting quantification, what we care about is photons. Not every photon is a completely equal impact, but because of the quantum nature of photosynthesis and other plant responses, it makes counting the photons a far better quantification than other lighting metrics. And we use moles and micromoles to make those photon counts manageable numbers. A mole of something is 6 with 23 zeros after it, so it's a huge quantity. But that's the order of magnitude that comes into play over a full day of a plant accumulating photons. For example, 17 moles per meter squared per day, that's a common number that comes up for head lettuce. Now, a micromole is 1/millionth of that quantity, so that's 6 with 17 zeros. And that's relevant when we're talking about the instantaneous amount of light on a per second basis, coming out of a light or hitting a plant surface. So for an example, 250, 300 micromoles per meter squared per second, that's relevant to that lettuce example. Now, from the light, we're talking about the photon flux, or the flow of photons coming out of light sources. It can be helpful to compare photons to like water droplets and think about this as if it was water. So this would be like the flow rate coming out of a hose or a sprinkler system, an irrigation system. And so the photon flux is how many photons are being produced every second. The units are micromoles per second. When we try to abbreviate that, it gets a little bit convoluted because where you need to identify which wavelengths of light are we actually counting. Historically, PAR, which is photosynthetically active radiation, basically blue, green, and red photons, has been the focus of things. But as time goes on, we recognize more and more the impacts of the photons outside of that region. And so it becomes a little convoluted whether we're talking about the PAR region, PPF, any photon PF, or some of these other terms, biologically active, the extended PAR region, to count more photons, especially when we're talking about LEDs. Broader is more useful than more narrow. We don't put LEDs in a light unless there's a purpose to them. So if you're buying a light that has far reds or UVAs, you want those photons counted into consideration in the process because they're intentional. So PAR is a little limiting. The other thing to address with PAR is that it's often misused in the sense of people will say, how much PAR did I give a plant? Or how much PAR did this light put out? PAR is just defining which colors of light we're talking about, to kind of narrow which photons we're counting. It's important to be clear whether we're talking about the photon flux or how much is hitting a plant. So that takes us to the next term, photon flux density. Now we're looking at the plants themselves, the surface that's receiving the light, and we can think of the plant as a bucket. So if you're using that water analogy, it's how quickly is the bucket filling up with water, but for light, it's how quickly is it accumulating photons to grow with or to be affected by. And so this is micromoles per meter squared per second. So we've got a unit of area attached to it. And if it's just the PAR region, this is ppfd. It's pretty common that people kind of use that abbreviation, even if you're not truly talking about PAR. But that the D on there is the density. Now we're talking about at the surface. And when we expand that to the whole day, we get to probably the most important quantification metric, the DLI. So this is the daily light integral. It's how full did that bucket get with photons over a 24-hour period. And if you're going to fixate on just one term and one metric to make your light plan, this is the one to do, because if you don't have enough DLI, if you don't have enough photons of energy to grow with, nothing else is really going to matter. The results won't be very good. And if you have extra, that can often make up for some other shortcomings, because in a lot of cases, the plants, there's not harm to the plants usually. It's just less efficient and a little bit wasteful, but the growth stays there. So too much is usually better than too little. And I mentioned this is over a 24-hour period. So we have another term here, the photoperiod. That's how many hours of the day did the plants receive light. So for DLI, that's important because the more hours of day length that we have with light, the greater the accumulation, the longer that bucket has to fill up, and the more DLI we get out of the same ppfd. Photoperiod also becomes very important when we're talking about morphological responses with short day and long day plants. And so the photoperiod, it's not about intensity, it's total hours. If you're talking about a long day, short day plant response, what truly matters is the length of darkness. In nature, that's kind of splitting hairs, but we're talking 14 hours of light versus 10 hours of darkness. But that's what triggers the long day response or a short day response in the plant. And with those terms, we can do, these are generalized numbers, but it's helpful to put some sort of quantification, some actual numbers to these terms to know what's low, what's high, and what sorts of numbers might we be looking for. So for natural ranges, again, this is oversimplification, but a winter day might be more like 5 moles of DLI for 9 hours. And over the course of 9 hours, that would average to something like 150 for the photon flux density. And in summer, it might be 10 times that, more like 50 moles of DLI that plants would naturally get from the sun. And so you see those numbers kind of show up in what plants are, what are good targets for different crops in different situations. Small plants, young plants, shade-loving plants, you might be down in that 5, 10, maybe 15 for a DLI number. So if you're providing 10 for propagation, for microgreens, for cloning, obviously, again, overgeneralizing here, there's times to go lower, there's times to push it higher, but that's kind of a DLI number, and something in the 150, 200 ppfd for these lower light plants is typically appropriate. And then that works its way up through bigger plants, and then when you start to get to vining and fruiting in the cannabis world, then the numbers get a lot higher, and we talk about 50 for a DLI or 1,000 ppfd, or sometimes even higher if the environment can sustain it for the plants. So 2 other quantification pieces of the puzzle here. Efficacy, this is addressing for the light fixtures themselves. How efficiently is it taking the watts of power going in and turning it into photons to be produced? So the unit at its simplest is micromoles per joule. That's the same thing as saying micromoles per second per watt of electrical input. And this is, the higher the better, but the higher the efficacy of the light, it's typically going to raise the cost of the light. So you're going to spend more upfront to try to reduce your operational expenses by using less power long term. And since this is a pros and cons thing here, and it's kind of an exponential cost increase to really push the limits on efficacy, there's going to be a sweet spot and a balance that's going to be different from one application to the next. If your power cost is higher and your hours of use is longer, and if you have maybe some limitations like available total power capacity, high efficacies on your light is going to make a lot of sense. But if you're not using your lights that many hours per year, or if your power costs are lower, or if there's utility incentives that makes it appealing to go one way or the other. It might make a lot more sense to settle for a good enough efficacy because the bottom line can be better. And then lastly here, uniformity. It would be nice if there was a simple way to quantify uniformity. In reality, you're going to see it reported different ways, represented visually different ways, put numbers on it different ways, depending on what lighting company, what software, what researcher is trying to present it. Ultimately, uniformity is a matter of how consistent is the light intensity across the grow space. If you can get yourself into a spot where 95% of your grow area is within 10% of the average intensity, that's fantastic. You're going to have very consistent nutrient usage, water usage, yields, finishing time, quality of the plant, and especially in an environment where if there's no sunlight or the vast majority of the light is coming from the LEDs, it's good to aim for something up closer to those sorts of levels. On the other hand, if you have maybe a quarter or more of your grow space that's more than 50% away from the average intensity, now you're going to start to see some inconsistency in the growth responses. But kind of like the efficacy, it's situational. How good is good enough and how much extra investment is worth it to try to pursue the best of the best here before, especially if you're in a greenhouse and 2/3 of your light's coming from the sun and 1/3 from the LEDs, you're not going to really see significant problems if your uniformity is just good as opposed to excellent. So that might be the sweet spot for you. Now, this is a topic spectrum that I'm not going to go into much depth at all because this could easily become 6 sessions on its own. So again, keeping it a little bit overgeneralized, but trying to lay some groundwork here of what to think about as you're approaching lights and trying to compare and process what the options are. A few things to keep in mind on the light spectrum. Blue photons, the shorter wavelength side of the visible spectrum, those are absorbed by a lot of different photoreceptors in the plant, and so it has multiple responses. It does drive growth, but not just growth. You tend to get secondary metabolite production, tighter internode spacing, thicker leaves, thicker stems, a lot of things that in most cases would be a higher quality plant. But this is coming at the expense of just raw biomass production because the plant's investing in these other aspects of growth. On the flip side, far red photons, so that's more in this right side of the graph here, we don't see those very well with our eyes. What those do in the plant is more shade avoidance responses. The plant's going to want to expand its leaves, get taller. It's basically trying to catch more light because it thinks it's in the shade when it's receiving a high quantity of far red photons. The benefit here is it can help with overall biomass accumulation, especially in the case of if you don't have a closed canopy yet. So if you looked at overhead view of your growing space and there's a lot of soil you can see, far red's going to be a little bit nice because it's going to help the leaves expand and catch more photons. So you get a little bit of an exponential start on things. But there's definitely a limit to how far you want to go down that road, or your plants get weak, floppy, not going to transplant well. It might lose some of the taste and smells and the overall quality of growth. So like everything, it's a balance here. In between those two regions, reds and greens, that's going to do a lot of just the general photosynthesis. Red is the typical emphasis in a grow light for 2 reasons. One, it drives photosynthesis quite efficiently. It's absorbed well by chlorophyll. And unlike blue, there's not a lot of competition for those photons with other photoreceptors. The other big thing is, from a technology standpoint, red diodes, deep red diodes have a good diode can be the highest efficiency, the highest efficacy photon generator out of the LEDs. So more photons out per watt in. Now, again, there's cost trade-offs here. If you use white LEDs to create lots of photons, it's going to typically be a little lower efficiency, but a little lower upfront cost for that light. So there's trade-offs. Now, another thing with reds, especially if the plant is on the smaller side and if the light intensity is on the lower side, you get more of that efficiency within the plant of turning each photon into a photosynthetic response. As the plants get bigger and as the light intensities get higher, you have more chances to saturate some of the leaf surfaces. And this is where some of this green, yellow, white part of the spectrum can become increasingly beneficial. Those photons tend to bounce more, transmit more. Deeper parts of the plant might be able to put those to use where the reds were all absorbed earlier on. So like so many things here, situational, there's some balances. Another thing with the greens and the whites and the yellows, it's nicer to work around those lights. Plants actually look green. People don't necessarily have risks of getting headaches. So it's quite common these days to have at least a little bit of white in the spectrum, if not a very strong white component. And then UV, that's another one I'm not going to go in deep into. That's more stress responses, pathogenic responses, or treatments on the plants. Can do more harm than good. Again, that's a whole nother talk. So finally, the environment and the application is very influential in terms of some of the things I've mentioned of how important is uniformity, how important is efficacy. Will you see much of a response at all if you change the spectrum? In a sole source environment where there's no sunlight around, so that can be a vertical farm, that could be a grow room, changes in the spectrum, uniformity, efficiency, intensity, those are going to have the most pronounced impacts in those environments. You're also more likely to have height constraints, which is going to limit what fixture shapes can work, but we're not concerned about shadowing in those environments, so we can make them low and wide and narrow. Supplemental environments, this is typically going to be a greenhouse. So we have sunlight, but it's not enough. The DLI from the sun is helping, but we want to have some more sun, some mini suns in our high intensity supplemental light bars. And typically, most common, it's a bar in a greenhouse or some sort of more compact shape because we do care about shadowing here. And then related to supplemental, but different. And again, sometimes these terms get misused, so it's helpful to clarify. Photoperiodic lighting, this is where the DLI from the sun is enough, but the length of light is not enough, meaning we want a long day response out of the plant and we're not getting it. And so here we need just very low intensities of light. Reds and far reds are the most reliable. Sometimes some environments, it doesn't actually matter, but kind of universally, a far red balance will trigger a long day response with very little light if all you need is that alarm clock that triggers the long day response. And now we're going to look a little bit at putting some meat on this. So we have a tool on the website that we launched recently that kind of takes these factors and lets you play with the numbers to see what happens if we err on the side of higher efficiency, lower efficiency, higher light targets, lower light targets, starting in different months. So it's basically everything I've just run through, but it's a way to put some numbers on it. Apologies to those outside of the US. It is US oriented in terms of when states are involved, but I'm going to do a quick example here to wrap things up to show, again, putting some meat on some things, seeing some implications, and then this is a tool that's out there, so if it's ever useful for you, feel free to dive into it. So first, the environment. Indoor or vertical situations, there would be no sunlight, but in a greenhouse, we're going to factor in what the natural light levels are. And so that's a little bit more involved of a process. We'll do that. The crop, this is kind of a shorter version of what I shared that one table of. Different crops are going to have different ranges of light targets that make sense, from at the highest end, the cannabis flowering source of production, whereas propagation, young plants are going to be lower light targets, and then various ones in the middle. These are generalizations, it's ranges, but it helps to give some sort of a target so that you can come in here and you can actually, again, get some real numbers to try to have a starting point for the lighting conversation, not that this is supposed to be the end all be all. And now, again, I've mentioned how every situation has differences. So just because we're growing basil in a greenhouse, that doesn't answer how much light we should target. We also have to factor in, is the goal to be productive in the wintertime, but just keep it overall more of a good enough situation in the winter, knowing that as the sun gets brighter naturally, everything's going to improve anyways? Or are you trying to keep June levels of production year round or somewhere in the middle? It's the way this kind of plays out here. So the range used in the calculator on the low side is a DLI of 10 to keep things good enough and trust that the sun will make it better in the summer, or something closer to ideal year round, or a nice middle ground 14 for a DLI. You can also override this and just put whatever you want in there. The state, this comes into play so that we can have an estimate of how much natural light is at play, also what sorts of electricity costs come into play. For those outside of the US, there's a really helpful tool I recommend. This is not our own, but I use it a lot very happily. You can get some DLI data of, this is outside of a greenhouse, so you want to reduce it by, for a sloppy number, take 40% away and count that as what your greenhouse is going to absorb. But you can click anywhere in the world and get some estimates of how much natural light you have. But so if we're in Michigan, that's where we're based out of. And if we're growing year round, meaning we need to be able to grow in December, an estimate for an average natural light we can truly count on is 4 to 5 for the DLI. If for some reason you're not actually starting in December and you can just work February through October, for example, then we don't need quite as much light because the sun is going to provide a higher intensity. So if we're targeting 14 for a DLI, getting 8 from the sun, then this is what's left for the LEDs to provide. Again, you can just come in here and override it if you have a target you know you want. Hours per day matters. That's how long we have to accumulate. The more hours you have where you can run the lights, the lower the intensity we need to provide from the lights themselves is. And in some cases, there's light pollution restrictions or other things going on where you might have to err on the side of less lights. But for a nice default answer, 18 makes sense. And again, you can override this if you want to target something different. Now we need to know what space are we lighting up. So we'll pretend we've got ourselves a 200-foot long greenhouse bay that's 24-foot wide, and we're going to light 2 of those bays up for now. So this gives us some square footage to work with. Height is very important in the light planning process. The more height we have, the more options we have for what fixtures can fit the space. And if you don't have much height, then we cannot space the lights out very far before we start to have uniformity issues. So especially if you're not shooting for a really high intensity, it's really helpful when there's a little bit more height to play with so that we can still use a high powered light and space them out. So here we'll stick in a height of 8 feet from the top of the plant to the bottom of the light to play with. And then one more business oriented, not plant oriented piece of the puzzle is basically CapEx versus OpEx. Are we trying to aim for the highest efficiency option, trying to aim for the lowest initial cost option just to get the business off the ground, or something in the middle? And most of what this comes down to is, are we looking for a good efficiency or trying to go great or excellent, higher and higher? Again, CapEx versus OpEx is kind of how that plays out. And let's say we're basically just trying to get something in place. Budget's not unlimited, so we're going to go for a minimum initial cost, which means we're going to use one of the lower efficiency options, knowing that that's going to keep the initial cost down. So now we get to the actual light plan suggestions. This is based on our own products, but you can look at the numbers to get broader applications. If somebody ever needs a calculator like this that's more agnostic or based on different options, let us know. We can always refine this whole tool. But what this shows is it's picking a 660 watt light bar, but it's picking our lowest efficiency version of it. It's about a 2.6 micromole per joule. There's higher efficiency options that'll get more light output from the same amount of power in, but we wanted the minimum cost. So there's the output per light using the square footage, using the square footage of the overall greenhouse space and the light intensity targets. We have a quick number of how many lights would be enough to generate the output we want in the whole greenhouse bay. And this takes into account certain amounts of losses because 100% of the photons will not hit the plants. Some will be spilled. And then we turn this into an actual setup. So we've got 2 rows of 16 lights, basically a 12 by 12 spacing to take into account the realistic geometry of the space. And then a suggestion of the height based on what was put in. Like I mentioned before, height's really important. For a standard LED that doesn't have reflectors or directionality changes or optics on it, a rule of thumb is you want the height to be between 1/2 and 3/4 of the light spacing to get uniformity without too much waste. So 12-foot light spacing, 8 feet of height is a nice number in that range. And this whole plan will get you about. What's that?
Can we start to round up?
Yep. And so the very final piece of this is some energy and cost numbers. So if we just incorporate everything that came here, and I'll just plow through this real quick. Here's the output, the number of lights, the watts. If we keep the 18 hours and say we're going to run it for 6 months of the year, we can get some total energy usage numbers times your electricity cost for your annual costs. And then we can stick some other values on here of, say it's $500 per light, and on the project, maybe you've got $15,000 in electricians and infrastructure, but a $10,000 utility incentive. So maybe we need $5,000 extra on there. And if we want to compare it to 1,000-watt high pressure sodium to see what would be a more legacy light equivalent, again, there's we'll throw some quick costs in here that would be maybe realistic to see what sorts of total ROI would we calculate. In this case, it's actually negative, but if we weren't using the lights as many hours as many months per year, you'll see the simple ROI payback changes based on usage.
Cool.
It would change a lot based on the cost of the lights. This gives you a place to play with some things and see at the end of the day, is this a good business decision? Is it under a year ROI? Absolutely, go for it. Are you not running the lights enough, so it's not going to be as appealing of a number? Do utility incentives come into play? We can help with all those processes. Others can help with those processes. But hopefully this tool is a useful one.
Perfect. Okay, Jeff, thank you very much for that. I think in light of the timings, I think we'll need to finish it there. But I think everyone will be beating a track to your door for the tool system. And from that, I would imagine they'll be wanting to chat to you. If you want to chat to Jeff about this, there you go. He can read my mind. We've got the details for contact here, but also on the networking site behind us, please contact Jeff. At least, I think actually this is if you're a newbie coming into the system or you're wanting to transfer over, that tool you've created is a real socializing tool to give people a feel for what the shock is, or actually that's not that bad after all in terms of cost and need. So that's been long needed, I would have to say, Jeff. So well done for that. Okay, so hopefully speak to Jeff. That's the end of today's session, and I'll do a quick roundup shortly. But thanks, Jeff. Hopefully speak soon.
Thanks, Eric.
Bye.